Okay guys, welcome to the gestures and poses tutorial for the month of March. So in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about how to capture an accurate gesture and pose and how I would approach different reference photos, as well as some of the thought process behind why I do certain things the way I do them. So it'll be like an insight into the way I like to capture poses based on some of the things that I've learned in the past in my life drawing classes. So hopefully this is going to be really helpful for you guys as well when it comes to your own drawings to be able to capture a convincing pose, because I know it's very difficult. So the structure of this tutorial is going to be pretty simple. We're going to talk about some of the basics first. I'm going to run you guys through some of the main things that you need to know before you start jumping into actually drawing, and then I'm going to show you guys some demonstrations of the way that I would try to draw certain poses and gestures. And then after this video, I'll see if I can put up a slightly sped up video of me just studying a bunch of poses and a bunch of gestures, just to give you guys a bit more material to work with there. And I will be providing you guys with a file containing all of the references that are going to be used in this tutorial. So with that being said, let's jump straight into it. So as you can see on the screen here, I've pulled up some human skeleton models. This is a very important first step for us to start understanding the inner workings behind each gesture and pose. So I'm going to go over some of the things that are most important that you want to keep in mind for the rest of this video, as well as for every single gesture that you draw. So anytime we're looking at a gesture, a pose from a human figure, we want to find the location of the skull, the cranium, and that is this area right here. It's really important to get this down, and you can see on some of the side views, this is what we're talking about. And once you've established this, okay, you want to also attach the jaw. You want to know the angle that the jaw is attaching at. So for example, side view, you're going to see something more like that. And that's the first thing that usually when I'm looking at a pose and a gesture, I would try to identify. Then we're going to look for the main gesture line, or like the line of action, as some people would call it. And that would be tied to the spine. That's the spine of this skeleton. And this line of the spine is going to kind of capture the essence of any pose. It's one of the most important aspects of capturing a convincing pose. And something to note about the spine is when you're looking at it from a side view or a 3/4 view, it's not going to be dead center. Instead, on a side view, you're going to see it's more located towards the back side of the body, whereas the front side is taken up mostly by the rib cage. And on a 3/4 view as well, you're going to see it's closer to the back. But when you're viewing a human body from the front or the back, it is right in the center. So before you start doing your gestures and stuff, I would recommend, studying up the anatomy of the human skeleton, just to understand, okay, where's the rib cage? How does it sit on the spine? Where is the pelvis? How do the legs attach to these joints? It's going to help you out a lot in terms of your understanding of the inner workings of the human body. It's going to make the gestures a little bit less intimidating for you. But with that being said, let's go back to the lines that we're looking for. So we found the cranium. Okay, this is the skull. I'm just gonna write this down, and we found the gesture line, or the line of action. And usually the next thing that I would look for in any kind of pose is the relationship between the shoulders. So we're looking at these joints right here. Okay, and we're going to draw a line straight through to connect the two joints. And the reason we're connecting this is because you're going to see a lot of poses where the shoulder joints are very dynamic. So when you raise your arm up, for example, this shoulder joint is also going to come up. If you don't raise that shoulder joint up in your drawing, it's not going to look like a very convincing pose. So in this case, the skeleton is standing in a very neutral pose, so the line is completely horizontal. Now, we found this. The next thing I usually like to look for to establish the feeling of the gesture is this area right here. So where the legs connect to the hips, and very similar to the shoulders, we're going to draw a line that connects the two joints in the hips. So this is the, I guess you could call it the hip line. And just like the shoulder line, as well as the gesture line in the middle that's following the spine, this hip line is going to tell us a lot about the pose. So these three components, along with the skull, are kind of like the foundation of any kind of gesture. If you want to be able to capture a gesture accurately, you have to get these lines and these angles right before you start applying the different anatomical structures on top of it. Okay, so that was a bit of an introduction to the basics and to the 4 elements that make up the foundation of the pose, which is the skull, the gesture line, the line of the shoulders, as well as the line of the hips. So I'm going to try to show you guys some of this in action. Okay, here's a skeleton with a very goofy pose. So what we're going to look for, obviously the first thing is where the head is, and we're going to mark down the jaw. So that's the angle of the jaw, and then we can mark down the angle of the head as we see it. And then the next thing is the spine. So we're going to follow the movement of the spine down. So you can see that there's kind of an angle coming together. And if I turn the original layer off, there's a bit of a feeling of movement in this pose already. So, and then as I said before, we would be looking for the line between the shoulder joints. In this case, they are almost horizontal, as well as the line in between the hips. In this case, it is pretty steep angle because the skeleton is putting most of its weight onto one leg. So what's going to happen here when I turn this layer off is you're going to get a sense of the movement of the body of the figure, even though we've only gotten 4 main elements down. So the skull, the gesture line, the line of the shoulders, as well as the line of the hips. These are very simple elements, but when we combine this together, we can start to get a sense of the movement of this gesture. And then as we get this solidified, we can start to look at some of the other areas. So for example, like this leg right here is where a lot of the weight is being distributed, and we're going to try to find this as well as the angle for this leg. And then you know, we can get up to the arms and try to capture that. And the theme of trying to capture a good gesture is relationships. So the relationships between joints, the relationships between different body parts. So we've mentioned the shoulder line as well as the hip line. Those are kind of like the relationships between the shoulder joints as well as the hip joints. Something else you want to look for is the relationship between the knees. So draw a line through, see if there's like any kind of discrepancy between like their position on the horizontal plane, and then look for the elbow joints as well. In this case, there's one that is much higher than the other one because of the dynamic pose that the arms are sitting in. Right, so now we turn the original layer off, and we really do start to get a sense of the movement of this gesture and the way it feels. So this is kind of the approach that I take when I'm thinking about a human figure and a gesture. You know, we really want to break it down and simplify things into the skull, the gesture line, the shoulder line, and the hip line, and then we build on top of this by finding the relationships and the angles of the different body parts. But it's a very simple approach. As long as you keep in mind the main elements you want to identify in each gesture, you can start to build on top of that. So it's like setting down a foundation and putting the anatomical parts on top. And that's really the way I think about every single gesture and pose I'm trying to draw. Those are the main elements that I try to identify before getting into any of the smaller details and worrying about rendering and all that. Okay, great. So now that we've kind of covered the basics, I'm going to start applying that to some of these reference photos so you guys can see this method in action. Now, one thing to note about practicing gestures and poses is you want to set a time limit for yourself for each pose. You don't want to take too long to do a single pose, because after a certain point, when you've laid down the foundations, you're getting into more details and rendering and not so much actually thinking about the gesture anymore. So we really want to focus on the most important part of our learning, which is setting down the foundations and capturing the essence, like the feeling and the movement of a pose, without necessarily paying too much mind to the details and the rendering or anything like that. So let's get into the first one. We're going to start off with a very simple standing pose. Our model is very relaxed. There's not, you know, any kind of crazy gesture going on here, but we're going to follow the exact same process that I outlined in the previous part of this video, which is we're going to find the skull of our figure and we're going to find the angle of the jaw. So with that, we can find the angle of the face. So you can see his head is leaning towards the side a little bit. So we want to mark that down. We want to take note of that, and we want to take note of the line in between the eyes. So this is kind of like giving us a sense of the angle of the head. And this is usually the first thing that I like to map out with any kind of figure that I'm drawing. So the next thing, like I said before, is we're going to look for that line of the spine. Now we can't see it obviously, but we're going to try to imagine. The spine is going to attach to the back of the skull. It's going to run down the neck, and it's going to go somewhat down the center of the body. But since our model is turned a little bit, keep in mind the spine is located at the back of the body, so it might be shifted on a bit of an angle right there. and we're going to try to mimic that exact angle in our drawing as well. So there's a bit of an S curve to this pose overall. So the next thing is we're going to look for the shoulders, and even though there's clothing on top, we can still kind of see where the shoulders peak at their outermost point. So that right there, as well as that right there, and there's a bit of an angle to that, and that's exactly what we're going to mark down in our drawing as well. And then as we move down, we can start looking at the hips. Obviously a lot of clothing, we can't really see what's going on here, so I'm going to assume it's going to be something like this. It's a little bit hard when there's a lot of clothing in the way, but we're just going to put that down on our drawing as well, just kind of get a sense of the overall angles. And don't worry if your lines go all over the place. The point of doing gestures and practicing poses is to be very loose and very fast. Notice the S curve in the spine that we've mentioned before. It kind of follows down into this leg as well, and this is a very prominent angle in this entire pose, and it's kind of like bringing the entire pose back into like the center point. And take note of the foot in relation to the head. It's kind of like directly underneath the head in the center of the body. That's because our model is placing most of his weight on that one leg, and that one leg is supporting the entirety of the body, whereas the other leg, you can see right there, is very relaxed. So it's the knee is bent as opposed to straight, and there's a lot less force being applied to it, so it's not directly under the center of gravity. So that kind of relates back to what we said about finding the relationships between things, right? The relationship between the shoulders, the hips, and where we found the relationship between the head and the foot. This is supporting the majority of the model's weight, so it's going to be at about the center. And then after we found these elements, we can start to kind of polish it out a little bit, right? Find where the rib cage might be, where the hip might be, and according to the gesture lines, of course, we can start adding in. We can start adding in the legs. I usually like to use ovals to kind of just represent these shapes. Very, very simplified. Then we want to find the knee joint, and I feel like I've made the leg a little bit too short, so we're going to just change that up a little bit. And again, take note of the relationship between the knees. So this one's a bit lower than that one, and we're gonna draw that exactly as we see it. Right, there's that angle right there in the knees to give him a bit more of a relaxed feeling in the other leg. Whereas on this leg right here, it's going to be stiff because it's going to be supporting the majority of his weight. So again, connecting these points back to the body using some very simple oval shapes, following the general anatomy of the human body, but we're not paying too much mind to the small details. Right, so at this stage we can move back up top to try to capture like some of the position of the arms, which is just in his pockets. It's very relaxed. Get that down, and we can, add in some of the shapes of the t-shirt. But keep it very simple. You remember, like, you want your pose to be readable more so than detailed. And then I'm going to draw the flesh on the neck so that it's properly attached to the body, and we can give him some lines connecting the shoulders. And as you go through this, you can start to erase some of the original construction lines so that the figure becomes a little bit more readable and a little bit more coherent overall. Get the pockets there so that you know what's going on. But that's pretty much it for our first pose. It's very simple, very quick. We don't want to focus on any of the details. We just want to get the essence of the movement of our character. And I think this representation here really captures that pretty effectively. So now let's move on to another standing pose. We're going to be following the exact same process for this as well. The first thing we're going to find is the location of the skull and the angle of that. So I think it's going to look something like that. So after we've established this, we're going to start looking for the gesture line, which is the line of the spine, and that's following another kind of an S curve in this model, because she is standing with most of her weight on one leg as well. We're going to try to just mimic that to the best of our ability in our drawing as well. And right there. So something else that you're going to note here is, since she is placing most of her weight on one leg, her foot is actually going to line up with her head, because that is her center of gravity. So we want to always be aware of these relationships because they're super important to the poses we're trying to capture. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try to find the angle of the shoulders. There's one that's raising up a little bit, but the one at the front, she's kind of like doing a bit of a shrug with her front arm. And then we're going to find the angle of the hips. So you can see one leg is connecting about right there and the other leg is connecting right about there. And you can find the angle in between those two. And that kind of is like the opposite of the angle of the shoulders. So now we're going to try to mark that down on our drawing. Something else to think about is the relationship between the shoulder and the chin. Usually when a shoulder is higher than the chin, that means your character is going to look like they're shrugging. When a shoulder is lower than the chin, your character might be standing in a more neutral pose. Or if you're looking at a character from, like, say up top, the shoulder is going to start coming up next to the chin. So again, like, relationships between the different body parts, very important to keep in mind. So now that I've kind of outlined the shoulder joints, I can start going in with the shape of the rib cage, as well as the shape of the pelvis, just to give the character a little bit more volume, and following again the angle of the hips. So as we go down to the lower body, since the majority of her weight is on her right leg, this leg in front is a lot more relaxed, and we're going to take note of that and reflect that in our gesture. So this right leg, since it's supporting the majority of her weight, it's going to be stiffer, it's going to be straighter than the leg that is in front, and the one in front is kind of like bent forward. So take note of where the knee is, kind of like an angle, and connect it back with very simple oval shape, right? And then take note of where the ankles are. In this case, there's a bit of an angle in between the two ankles as well. So there's an ankle right here, and then we're going to find the calf, the volume of the calf, and then place that other ankle along that same angle, so that we know that this foot is kind of raised and she is not standing on the entire foot but the front. So I've kind of worked from the top to the bottom here for this gesture, but we're going to now go back into the arms, and we're going to try to place them in here according to the angle that they're at. There's one right there, and the other one is kind of going up. Again, look for the big angles, right? So there's coming out like this, coming out like that, and take note of like the negative space between the arm and the head as well. So we're going to try to capture that angle exactly as we see it. Back down, some shoulders there. And if you want, you can add some elements of the hair, just so you know what you're looking at, and very, very simple facial features if you want. Now we can go in, erase some of the construction lines, and you've got yourself a pretty convincing pose based on our reference photo. All right, here's another interesting standing pose, a little bit more arms in this one. So we're gonna do the exact same thing. We're gonna find the skull, which she is looking straight at us. So circle, and then we're gonna mark down the angle of the head. It's very important for the gesture. If you want the gesture to work, you need to really get the head down. And then we are gonna look for that gesture line, which is the spine, and it kind of like curves in this direction and goes down into this leg right here. So we're gonna find the spine right there, which kind of curves in that direction. So since our model is placing weight on both legs, you're gonna see if you draw a line straight down from the head, that's her center of gravity, but she is distributing the weight equally between the 2 feet. That's why not one leg is coming in to support the entirety of her weight. And I feel pretty good about that gesture line now, so I can try to look for the angle of the shoulders. So again, look for that joint and then try to see through the arm to look for the other joint. And I would say it's going at about this kind of an angle. And then as we look for the hips, where the legs attach to the hips, we're looking at a bit of an opposite angle there. So mark that down on your drawing as well. That is kind of like one shoulder, and then the other shoulder is going to be like right over there, and the body's kind of like twisting in this angle, so we want to take note of that as we start adding some volume to the rib cage. And then as we go down to the hips, we want to keep in mind the angles of the hip joints which attach to the legs. So now the core of the character is pretty much polished up, but we want to start finding the angles of the legs. So in this case, I'll be adding an oval right there, and since she is distributing her weight pretty evenly, there's going to be one foot on this side and another foot on that side, and we're going to try to attach that with a knee joint, the calves. And erase any excess lines if you need to during this process, but you want to keep it very, very loose from the beginning to the end. Remember, our focus is not on details, but it's on capturing the movement and the essence of a pose. So I put down this shape for the arm, and you can see the arm is kind of like going in this direction, and we want to look for this kind of an angle here in the arm, and then we want to find the angle of the supporting arm on this side, which kind of goes down like this and then comes back up at an angle like that. And we find the elbow joint, attach that, bring it up. And if you're not sure about like how long a limb should be, just try to find relationships between it and the rest of the body. So like if you are not sure how long you should make this arm, look for the wrist joint and see where it lines up with the chin. So I know that it's going to kind of stop right there, and that's going to be the beginning of the wrist, right? Because of that relationship to the chin. So a big part of drawing an accurate gesture is just finding these relationships between things. There are like, obviously the main ones are the shoulders, the hips, as well as the main gesture line. But you know, there are also other things like the knee joints as well as the elbows that can tell you a lot about the way a character is moving. So I would say that's a pretty convincing rendering of the pose, and if we were to actually jump into turning this into a full painting, you would start to work on top of this to build up the details. But the first stage of capturing any kind of a gesture or a pose is very loose and very free, and you want to really get that energy in there. Okay, so now for our last kind of like standing pose, we've got this one right here. It's going to be a little bit tricky because he's got very baggy pants, so we can't really see too much of what's going on, but we can try to assume. So the first thing we're going to look for, obviously, again, is the skull. We're going to find the shape of the skull right there. Take note of the angle of the head, so where he's looking, as well as whether or not there's any angle on the tilt of the head as well. In this case, there's not too much. Right, so now that that's been established, we're going to try to move down and find the gesture. So I think the spine is going in a bit of a curve, and it's going to lead into this leg as well as form an angle with this leg right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to look for that spine. We're going to try to lead it into that leg and then get that angle down to this his left leg, and then take note of the angle of the shoulders. In this case, it's very apparent. We can see exactly what's going on here, right? So the shoulder joints are forming a bit of an angle right there. So we're going to just mark that down on our drawing as well, right there. And then let's look for the hips, which I think they're pretty even. So something like this. There's going to be a little bit of foreshortening in the legs because he is stepping out in a bit of a lunge pose. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to flesh out the body based on these main elements that we've established. Right, so if we're unsure about how the legs should look, we're gonna look for the relationship between the knees. All right, there's a bit of an angle there, and then we can look for the relationship between the ankles or the heels, and there's a bit of an angle right there as well. It's gonna show us a lot about the overall structure of this pose. And it's really important to identify these relationships, because if we put the knees in the wrong place, and if we put the ankles in the wrong place, this whole thing's gonna fall apart. So I can kind of assume this ankle's gonna be right there, and the other one is very, very foreshortened. So, it's gonna be quite a bit shorter. That's pretty good. That's pretty convincing. Now let's get into the arms a little bit. So we're gonna look for the main angle of the bicep and the tricep right there. And again, we can find the angle between the elbows. So the other one's gonna be way back there because there's a lot of foreshortening happening, right? Like that. Find the forearm, and this forearm's gonna come in front. Something like this, and he's holding a sword, so we want to get that down as well. And at this point, if you want, you can start to erase some of the construction lines and some of the loose lines out to get a better read on the entire pose. All right, so once again, extremely simple approach to the pose, but you can see like there's absolutely zero detail. I'm completely overlooking the clothing, the folds, all of that. Instead, we want to break it down to the most basic, the most fundamental gesture in the pose, and we want to get the feeling of this movement of the human body down. And this really provides a very solid foundation for whatever the next step might be. You might want to do some line art over top of it. You might want to do some rendering over top of it. Whatever it is, when you can find the pose and find the main elements and identify the movement of the pose, it's going to make your overall painting and whatever it is that you're doing a lot more convincing. Okay, so that was pretty much it for part one, where we covered the basics and I go over some not too complex standing poses with you guys. In part two, we're gonna start looking at some action poses and things that are a little bit more complex than what we've seen here so far. So look forward to that, and I hope this explanation of the process has been pretty easy to understand for you guys. But yeah, I'll see you guys in part two.